Good evening. Welcome to the Woodchuck Report on this day, Friday, December 14th, 2018. And today I got several things for you today. Discussions today would be about, what deficits, some free trade, and the so-called rise of China, decline of U.S., and depending on how much and how quickly I talk, I might talk about fertility rate and how it affects the U.S. economy, but obviously our fertility rate. So, big things today is we talk about the deficit. Now, layman's term, what is a deficit? Well, to be the term, a deficit is nothing more than the opposite of a surplus. Now, to put it into more economic terms, it's used to describe the difference between a cash inflows and outflows of a given economy. For example, how much you buy, how much you sell. So, a nation's imports exceeds its exports, you're going to have a deficit. For example, if fictional nation here exports or imports $3 billion worth of imports and has $2 billion worth of exports, that's going to be a $1 billion deficit. That's pretty much the basics of how that's going to work. Now, what are the implications of a deficit? Now, the implication is there's more value entering the country than there is leaving the country, buying and selling. So, what are the things that trade deficits can do? Really is they generally, over a long-term period, will cause the drops in domestic currency's value and a reduction in jobs. Now, that usually gets offset by a whole host of issues, and many economists far smarter than me will tell you all sorts of things about what the goods and the bads of a deficit. Now, I'll use this example here is we're going to have a country called IOTA. Don't ask, I just thought of it. So IOTA produces all the things it needs. So, but it exports, say, snowboards. It manufactures snowboards, for argument's sake. So it exports about $600,000 in exports of snowboards, but it doesn't have, say, oil to keep the snowboard factories running. So it must import the oil. Now, if it imports $1 million worth of oil and exports the $600,000 of snowmobiles or snowboards, whatever I just said earlier, you're going to see, by math, $400,000 deficit. That is pretty much the basic ins and outs of it. So one of the big things why I'm talking about it is because as a country, the U.S., we run huge trade deficits with many of our trading partners. In fact, almost all our trading partners. There are some examples. And I know a lot of my libertarian friends and my right-leaning friends will say that's a bad thing and that's a bad thing, although there are some left-leaning people who will say that's a bad thing too. But it basically is, that's how we are. We have a very strong currency relative to a lot of other countries that we trade with. So what is the incentive of that? Well, if we have a strong currency, our buying power is greater. It is better for us, America, to buy more due to our strong currency than it is to sell. It is more expensive for, say, I'll pick on Panama today. Panama to buy our stuff because their currency is weak. Panama is actually a terrible example because they use the US dollar. So I'll pick Sudan, for all my Sudanese people who may randomly be watching this. So the Sudanese currency is weaker than the US. So as a Sudanese importer, it is much more expensive for you to import stuff from America, but it's a lot cheaper to export your stuff. So you're going to see a trade deficit between America and Sudan. Why? American dollar is stronger relative to Sudan. American dollar buys more Sudanese products relative to Sudanese buying American products. That's just the way it is. We have a bigger example, in the elephant in the room would be China. We have huge trade deficits with China. And President Trump has, in various policies and campaigns, said he wants to change that. My basic head says that's not going to happen, and please don't try. Because the problem is, our dollar is very strong compared to China. Everyone knows this. Chinese produce and manufacture pretty much everything under God's sun. We buy their products, they tend to buy less of ours. Comes with a trade deficit. How do you change that? Well, unless you can get Chinese country to buy more American, products, it's not going to happen. The flip side of that is you Americans in of themselves buy less Chinese products. Now, voluntarily, that would be great, but that's not actually going to happen. We like Chinese cheap products. I would take my arch nemesis here at Walmart. The majority of Walmart's products come from China. How are you going to get Americans to buy less Chinese? Well, I don't know. Figure that out. That's way beyond the scope of, way beyond the scope of this broadcast. But things that we can talk about is the current deficit, trade deficit we have, and also the budget deficit. How we spend more than we tax-wise, our revenue is less than our expenditures. So now the CBO, which is the Congressional Budget Office, this on Thursday, which would be yesterday, published its annual compendium for options for shrinking the massive federal deficit, which currently is standing at $779 billion. Now, this is an extremely long list, and I'll go into it shortly, but let me, as I switch into the budget deficit, let's talk about that. So, the U.S. posted its widest November budget deficit on record as spending doubled. Now, the outlays, which is our expenditures, jumped 18% to $411 billion last month, while receipts, how much we made, were little changed at $206 billion. So to put it in more, people-friendly terms, imagine if your everyday bills this year went up 18% and you were paying $411 in bills last month, while your paycheck was only $206. You have a problem. So what does that mean? Well, there's your shortfall of $205 billion, which compared to this time last year was $139 billion. So the shortfall increased. Back to limit terms, what does that mean for you if you were this person? No, this means you are borrowing money to pay for the excess. Because as I said, you spent $411, but you only made $206, which means there's a $205 difference. It has to come from somewhere. So the U.S. ran its largest deficit in 6 years in fiscal year 18. Fiscal year starts in October, for those who didn't already know. And when the tax cut package raised the federal spending for the military and other priorities. If you remember, there was a huge fight. There was the tax cuts, which many people were for. It didn't actually do anything. It only actually ended up, we know this in hindsight. We also knew this when it was proposed, that it would increase the deficit. So, adding to the growing federal budget deficit, it's expected to hit $1 trillion by 2020, which is in 2 years, by the way, which coincides with the next presidential election. Expect that to be a huge campaign issue for all parties. So, for the first 2 months of the fiscal period, October, November, as I said, fiscal period starts in October, the gap widened to $305.4 billion compared to $201.8 billion same period last year. So why is this significant? Because fiscal year 18 is generally considered President Trump's first full complete year. So no longer can he say this is Obama's fault or this is, Obama did it or Obama didn't do it. It's just, this is how it is. So spending on DoD, Department of Defense, rose 18% in October-November from the same period last year, while the outlays, expenditures for total interest on the public debt rose 7%. The interest on our debt rose 7%. Now, back to the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, which publishes annual compendium for options for shrinking the massive federal deficit, which is currently standing at $779 billion. So they came up with several different options, 121 to be more exact, for how to lower and reduce the deficit. So most of the savings will be coming from changes to entitlement programs, social welfare programs, whatever you wish to call it, like Medicare and Social Security, but other suggestions will drum up trillions in savings and revenue over the next decade. Now, they laid out 121 options, and most of which would save $10 billion or more over that same period. And I actually found an article that talked about some of the bigger ones that I would do. So bear with me if you want a piece of paper to write this down. So one of the big things is slashing the Pentagon's budget. So one scenario for cutting the DoD's budget results in a reduction of $591 billion through 2028. And of course, President Trump said he's seeking to boost the Pentagon's budget, which he faced some backlash when he proposed on cutting it 5%. Of course, everyone would know the military-industrial complex is a big component and actually the largest lobbying group in corporate America. And also how, politically speaking, it's what's called a bad idea to talk about military budget cuts. But fiscally speaking, it's going to happen. If we want to reduce this deficit, it's going to happen. You can't look at a budget deficit without looking at reducing the military budget. Now, another thing would be capping the Medicare spending. This will limit federal spending for the entitlement program that generally helps millions of low-income Americans with health care costs and could generate a gross saving of about $805 billion between 2020 and 2028. Another one is instituting a carbon tax. We all know how taxes work. But it will be imposing a tax on greenhouse gases, which could help tackle climate change and would increase federal revenues by $1.1 trillion over the next 10 years. There's another one, which I'm already against this idea. I do love my NASA, but saying goodbye to space exploration. If all NASA's money is eliminated for human exploration and operation starting in 2020, the government would save about $89 billion through 2028, which to me seems, if I may use the word, asinine and deplorable. You know, $89 billion in the big scheme of things over an 8-year period, it seems very little. I could save $89 billion in that same 8-year period just by cutting, $10 billion each year from the military budget. But again, military budget, very hot potatoes, if you will. Imposing a tax on financial transactions, taxing certain financial transactions like the purchase of stocks and bonds could yield about $777 billion in extra cash in the next decade. Clipping funds for international affairs. If the money for diplomatic programs and global health initiative was reduced by 25% starting in 2020, it could yield a savings of approximately $116 billion through 2028. Eliminating Head Start, which is the federal pre-K program for low-income families, serves about 900,000 children in year 2017. The CBO says that killing that will save approximately $92 billion. Seems like a pointless thing to do then. Eliminating Head Start has long been a conservative priority, although Trump's fiscal 2019 budget request would have given it a minor boost. Tossing out housing vouchers, scrapping the Housing Choice Vouchers program which helps low-income families afford housing in the private market, would reduce the federal spending by approximately $125 billion between 2020 and 2028. Downsizing the Pell Grants is the last one on this, which is reducing the amount of federal grants awarded to low-income students for undergraduate education and will cut back on mandatory spending by $62 billion over a 10-year period, which is another option. Again, $62 billion in that same period seems like a very unnecessary amount of money to be spending, or to be cutting, when, again, we spend approximately $730 billion on the military budget. But again, that's just me. So that's where we're going for this on deficit. I'm just going to keep going because, like I said, it has several topics to be talking about. So now, the next big thing in terms of deficit is, how deficits come about, and we're going to look at, free trade. Now, Trump had the NAFTA 2.0, which he calls the USMC, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement, which is nothing more than NAFTA 2.0. Yes, there are some concessions, for example, opening up the Canadian dairy market as such, but more or less it's just increasing the amount of products that were of cars and automobiles from the 62.5%, I believe, to about 70-something%. I don't have the exact information here, but I believe I talked about it in the last show. So those were the big concessions, but otherwise it's essentially NAFTA 2.0. So a whole lot of talking and shouting just for nothing, really. And as such, the whole tariff on steel and ores did not go away anytime. So there you go. Now, free trade. Free trade is nothing more than a trade policy that does not restrict imports or exports. Now, buyers and sellers from different economies are able to voluntarily, without government applying tariffs, quotas, subsidies, or prohibitions on goods, services, and labor, and it's the opposite of trade protectionism or economic isolationism, which is a trend that we're slowly getting back into, which is and will contract the economy in the long term. That's not me saying, that's just basic economic facts that we've seen this before. Hindsight is always 20/20. Now, politically, a free trade policy may simply be the absence of a trade policy and is referred to as laissez-faire or trade liberalization. So governments with free trade agreements do not necessarily abandon all control of imports and export taxations. And in current modern times, there's few free trade agreements that are actually result in completely free trade. The U.S. being a big one, we don't actually have a true free trade with any of our trading partners, contrary to popular belief. So, in a free trade regime, both economies can experience faster growth rates. It would be no different than voluntary trade between, say, neighbors, towns, cities, villages, and even states. So, free trade enables companies to be able to concentrate on where they have the distinct competitive advantage, and they're able to expand the diversity of their products, the knowledge, the skills, and their skill base. And the free trade also helps encourage specialization and division of labor. So, I actually have an article here, relatively long. It's free trade. This is by the Econolib. So take from it whatever you wish, but I read little bits and pieces of here so I don't go on and on. So, for more than 2 centuries, economists have steadfastly promoted free trade among nations as the best trade policy. Despite this intellectual barrage, many practical men and women continue to view the case for free trade skeptically, as an abstract argument made by ivory tower economists with at most one foot on terra firma. These practical people know that our vital industry must be protected from foreign competition, which is always a big thing. Everyone always likes free trade until it messes with their market and forces them to compete. So the divergence between economists' belief and those of even the well-educated men and women on these streets seem to rise in making the leap from individuals to nations. In running our personal affairs, virtually all of us exploit the advantage of free trade and comparative advantage without thinking twice. For example, many of us have our shirts laundered at professional cleaners rather than wash and iron them ourselves. And anyone who advised us to protect ourselves from the unfair competition of low-paid laundry workers by doing our own wash would be thought as loony, which kind of makes sense in the thing. It's the reason why the laundry, we have someone else do it. It's cheaper and it's more economical in our favor. Now, common sense tells us to make use of companies that specialize in such work, paying them with money we earn doing something we do better. We understand intuitively that cutting ourselves off from specialists can only lower our standard of living. So, in a wrap, just extrapolate that to large nations, and that is what we have. We don't have it actually for many couple of reasons. Now, for the U.S. does not have any genuine free trade with other countries, including countries it has free trade agreements with, as I just said earlier. Many politicians oppose free trade on the basis that certain sectors, such as manufacturing, may suffer if forced to compete with foreign producers. Big case in point, the coal industry. The coal industry magnates and giants were one of the largest supporters of Trump. Why? What did he say? He's going to bring coal back. Why? Over the decades, plural, the coal industry has been facing competition, not only from foreign workers itself, but even other industrial gas workers, companies. For example, coal competes with the oil and gas industry for energy. Will coal ever go away? No. Can it go away? Arguably. There are alternatives. to that, but that would be a different discussion, which I'll write down for next time, as my pen decides not to work in the time I need it to work. So, in terms of the free trade, many non-American sellers, foreign companies, they face various barriers to entries and tariffs on imports. They have to compete against many subsidies. For example, if you're in the agricultural industry, the dairy industry, for example, it's heavily subsidized. Why? Because of specialization and actually technological process. Cows of today produce way more milk than cows of tomorrow. So a big dairy company with 2, 3, 5,000 heads can produce way more milk than, say, a small farmer in, say, Williston, who may have 200, 300, 500 heads of cattle of dairy producing milk. So, that's the part where technology kicks in. Now, actually, I'm going to leave this because as I see I'm crunching into time, and I actually want to leave some of the other stuff. So my next topic would be the so-called rise of China and the decline of U.S. This is actually a kind of a relatively short topic because it's more of a relative term than anything else. And I say that only because, a lot of people are saying, especially on the right-leaning half of the political spectrum, says, rise of China, rising China, we got to increase military expenditure to contain our rising China. Well, here's the truth. There wouldn't be a rise of China if we stopped giving them money. And by that, I mean we do a lot of trade with them. We are their largest trading partner. Will there be a rise in China? Well, duh. Of course there's a rise in China. If you're giving your neighbor money, a lot of money, they're going to spend the money. And they're going to spend the money the way in which they see and do things. So if you don't want them to get richer, stop giving them money. Now, I said that, kind of facetiously, but that is more or less the gist of it. We have a lot of trade with them. Is their economy going to grow and get bigger? Yes. Why? They do a lot of trade, not just with us, but with the entire world. So the real issue isn't that we need to that we need to face is not really the rise of China, but more or less the decline of America. And the rise of China is not really inevitable. It is inevitable because population thing, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But it's a relative terms in which you look at it, the rise of China, but also because the U.S. is not rising as fast, or comparatively speaking, to China. And some will even say that the U.S. is declining. I won't go and say that out loud. I just think, personal opinion, that yes, our growth rate isn't as high as it used to be. Is it sustainable? Arguably, no. But these are some of the consequences we need to start facing and preparing for. So, the question really now should be is, how do we get the U.S. to grow faster or just grow again? Someone would say, the growth rate last quarter was hit 4% and such, but those were only a couple of quarters, and it's actually on the trend down now. So, was it sustainable? No. But the question is how do we get this growth rate to be up and sustain it? Well, one thing is trade protectionism, which we have entered now, is the opposite of what we want to do. Free trade, as I just said, helps all members, especially us. We are a very large economy, and we need to keep growing. If you wish to keep growing, you must grow. And hopefully avoid policies that contract that. But if the U.S. is growing, and everyone feels the U.S. is growing, then the whole rise of China is not really a problem. If the country in of itself feels like it's growing and things are good, you really don't care about what's happening outside of you. Now, some of the problems is that our society is very divided, and that there's very few things that we can agree upon in terms of, for example, our trade policies, immigration policies, a prime example. Even amongst us libertarians, there is a stark contrast in the varying immigration policies that we aspire to have. So there are groups, which favor protectionist policies for one socioeconomic class, and other groups that favor protectionist policies for other economic class. Both sides are neither help, and they only help makes things worse. but they are politically viable. Everyone likes for their industries to be protected. Coal miners, I pick on the coal industry because I like picking on them. They saw the decline of coal. What does that mean? Well, if you're a coal worker, you don't want to see that industry decline, even though from the big picture perspective, it needed to. It is a dirty job, and there are better, more efficient, and far more lucrative energy sources. Our gas. Natural gas is the one that is more or less taking its place. Although nuclear is the next best policy, but again, don't at me. That's another discussion later. So, and one of the things I want to transition to before I go here, seeing as I have about several more minutes, is the economy really is defined by your population. And I know some people are going to say something, but no, in layman's terms, you don't have an economy if you have 0 people. You don't have an economy, arguably, you don't have an economy if you have 1 people. You have economies when you have more than one person in which they start doing trade. So the more people you have, the higher population, your economic potential, so to say. Now, currently, we're sitting about 320, 330 billion people. I'm getting a countdown. And right now, that's going to segue straight into my next topic. Which is the fertility rate. Now, these are the 2050 population potential projections. So, India is projected by 2050 to have 1.7 billion people and overtake China. China is projected to have 1.3 billion people. The US is projected to have 398 million people. Nigeria is projected to actually catch up to us with 398 million people. And Indonesia is going to round up the top 5 with 327 million people. So, what does that exactly mean? And why do I say those numbers? I say that because there's a thing, the total fertility rate. It's more or less what's the birth rate in order to maintain your population. As I was saying, you can't have an economy without a population. When your population starts to decline, your economy, will fall shortly. Case in point being Japan. Japan has been in a recession for the last 2 decades, plus or minus. Why? Because their birth rate has fallen and has fallen fast. I believe they're approximately at 120 million people, and their 2050 projection is actually to drop below 100 million people. So it's kind of scary to think from an economic perspective, in that if you wish to have your economy grow, you kind of need more people to be in your economy. So this is another article. This is by the Associated Press, and it's dated for its updated May 17th, 2018. So I'm going to use a lot of their numbers. Obviously, they know a lot more of the numbers than I do. But women in the U.S. gave birth last year at the lowest rate in 30 years, and a trend that will continue to weigh on economic growth in the coming decades, which is the whole point of this. So the CDC said that the number of U.S. babies, last minute, has fallen 2% from 2016, 3.85 million to a 30-year low. Now, birth rates have fallen for three straight years, and the fertility rate dropped 3% last year to 60.2 births per 1,000 women, ages 15 through 44. So one of the things that a aging society is going to weigh on the economic growth in the U.S. in the past decade, with the fast baby boomer generation retiring and fewer young people replacing them. So Thursday's data suggests that the trend is likely to continue. And economic growth is generally driven by population growth and worker efficiency, both of which have slowed in the past decade in the United States. So, the demographics have a really powerful impact on the economy, and the U.S. economy has grown at a 3% average annual rate since World War II, yet it hasn't reached that pace for a full calendar year since 2005. And the baby boomers first reached retirement age in 2008. So the short-term economic growth forecast is about to hit 2.7% for this year and 2.4% in 2019, partly because of Trump's administration tax cuts, but the Fed kept its long-run annual growth forecast at 1.8%.